I never imagined that the last thing I would leave behind in this world would be a confession. The room where I am writing this is quiet, almost painfully quiet. The machines beside my bed hum softly, measuring every fragile beat of my heart. Ironically, I am surrounded by the same sounds that once defined my entire life: hospitals. For 32 years, I worked inside them, long corridors filled with fluorescent light, the constant scent of antiseptic in the air, the distant echo of footsteps during the night shift. Most people only see hospitals during the worst days of their lives. For me, it became the only world I knew. People used to call me compassionate. Some called me strong. A few even called me an angel. But angels do not write confessions like this. I began working as a nurse when I was 23. I was young, determined, and naive enough to believe that medicine could save everyone. I believed that if we worked hard enough, cared enough, fought enough, death could always be pushed a little further away. It didn't take long for reality to correct that illusion. The hospital, where I spent most of my career, stood on the edge of a quiet town, an old concrete building from the 1970s with long corridors that seemed endless during the night. During the day, it was loud and chaotic. Doctors rushing between rooms, families speaking in worried whispers, phones ringing constantly. But the nights were different. Night shifts revealed the true soul of a hospital. After midnight, everything slows down. The lights dim slightly, conversations become whispers, the outside world disappears, and the building begins to feel like a floating island of suffering and hope. I worked the night shift for almost 20 years. You see things at night that most people never witness. The last breath of someone who has lived 90 years. A family crying quietly in a hallway. The silent moment when a heart monitor turns into a flat line. The first time I lost a patient, I cried for hours. He was an elderly man named Walter Green. He had been admitted for heart failure. I remember sitting beside his bed while he struggled to breathe, his hand trembling in mine. When the monitor finally went silent, I ran to the locker room and cried until my face hurt. Back then, I thought that losing a patient meant I had failed. But hospitals teach you something cruel with time. You cannot save everyone. Years passed, then more years. I watched hundreds of people arrive through those emergency doors. Some walked out again a few days later. Others never left. And slowly, something inside me began to change. At first, it was just exhaustion. Long nights, endless suffering, the quiet desperation in the eyes of patients who knew their bodies were failing them. Pain is something you can become accustomed to witnessing. What you never truly get used to is helplessness. Some patients begged us to help them sleep, not for a few hours, forever. Of course, we could never acknowledge those requests. Hospitals run on rules, protocols, ethics committees, legal warnings posted in every department. The word mercy is rarely spoken in medical halls. But suffering is everywhere. I remember a woman named Eleanor, stage 4 cancer. The disease had spread everywhere. Her body was little more than a fragile shadow beneath white sheets. Even the strongest painkillers barely touched her agony. Every night she looked at me with the same exhausted eyes, and every night she whispered the same words. Please let me rest. I always answered the same way. I'm sorry, I can't. But the truth is, I began to wonder if refusing her was really the compassionate choice. That question haunted me for months. Then came the night everything changed. It was winter. One of those bitter nights when the wind howls against the hospital windows and the corridors feel colder than usual. Snow covered the parking lot outside, reflecting the pale light of the emergency entrance. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. Around 2:30 in the morning, I walked into Eleanor's room to check her vitals. The monitors glowed softly in the darkness. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. When she opened her eyes and saw me standing there, she didn't look afraid. She looked relieved. "Tonight," she whispered. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stood beside her bed, listening to the sound of the machines and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Something inside my mind shifted in that moment. A line I had always respected suddenly felt fragile. For the first time in my life, I asked myself a question that no nurse should ever ask. What if ending suffering is not the same as causing death? Eleanor watched me in silence. Then she took my hand. "I'm tired," she said. And that was the moment my life began to unravel, because what happened next would change everything. And once you cross the line like that, there is no way to ever step back again. For years, I had followed every rule written in every hospital manual. That night, I didn't. I wish I could tell you that the decision came slowly, that I debated it in my mind for hours, weighing every possible consequence. But the truth is much more frightening than that. The moment simply arrived. Eleanor's hand was weak in mine, her skin pale and cold beneath the hospital blanket. The monitor beside her bed continued its quiet rhythm. Beep, 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 measuring the fragile persistence of a body that no longer wanted to fight. I looked at her chart. Terminal cancer, multiple organ failure. Pain management already at maximum levels allowed. She had been dying for weeks, and yet the machines kept her here. I stood beside her bed for what felt like an eternity. The hallway outside was silent. Most of the patients were asleep, and the rest of the night staff were busy in another wing of the building. No one was watching. Eleanor's eyes never left mine. "You know I'm not going to leave this hospital," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "You know how this ends." I did know. I had seen this ending hundreds of times before. Days of agony, the body slowly collapsing piece by piece, while machines and medication delayed the inevitable. In that moment, something inside me broke, or maybe something inside me woke up. I adjusted the IV line slowly, pretending to check the dosage. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to pause twice before continuing. The medication I held was normally used for sedation. In the right amount, it would simply help a patient sleep. In a higher dose, it would do something else. My heart was beating so loudly, I was certain someone in the hallway could hear it. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered suddenly. I froze. I hadn't done anything yet. But somehow she already knew. I don't remember exactly how long it took. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe a full minute. Time has a strange way of dissolving during moments that change everything. When I finally pressed the syringe into the IV line, my hands stopped shaking. For the first time that night, I felt completely calm. The medication flowed slowly through the tube. Eleanor closed her eyes almost immediately. Her breathing softened, the painful tension in her face slowly disappearing. She looked peaceful, more peaceful than I had ever seen her. For several minutes, nothing happened. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Then the sound began to slow. Beep, 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 until finally the line on the screen stretched into a quiet, endless tone. A flat line. I stood there, staring at the monitor, unable to move. I expected panic. I expected guilt. I expected to collapse under the weight of what I had just done. Instead, there was silence, a strange, heavy silence inside my chest. I checked the time of death and followed the normal procedures. When the doctor arrived 15 minutes later, nothing seemed unusual. Terminal patients passed away during night shifts all the time. No one asked questions. No one suspected anything. That was the moment I should have stopped. But the human mind is dangerous when it begins to justify its own actions. For days, I told myself the same thing. She was suffering. You helped her. You gave her peace. And the more I repeated those words, the easier they became to believe. Weeks passed, then months. I continued working the night shift as if nothing had happened. The hospital remained the same, bright during the day, hauntingly quiet at night. But something had changed inside me. Now, when I walked through the corridors and saw patients trapped in endless pain, I no longer felt helpless. I felt powerful. At first, I resisted the thought, but suffering has a way of eroding moral boundaries. The next time it happened was with a man named Richard Cole, 76 years old, advanced neurological disease. His body had slowly betrayed him over the years until he could barely speak or move. Every night he stared at the ceiling while the machines around him kept him alive. One night when I entered his room, he struggled to whisper a single word. Please. Just that. Nothing more. I stood beside his bed for a long time, and eventually I did the same thing I had done before. The same syringe, the same quiet room, the same slow fading of the monitor. After that, something terrifying began to happen. It became easier, not immediately, but gradually. Each time I told myself the same story. I'm helping them. I'm ending their suffering. I'm giving them peace. But deep inside, another truth was slowly growing, a truth I refused to face. Because what I had begun to feel in those moments wasn't only compassion, it was control. Inside those quiet hospital rooms, in the middle of the night, I held something no doctor, no machine, and no medicine could truly control. Life and death. Over the next 3 years, more patients passed away during my night shifts than anyone noticed at first. Terminal cases mostly. People whose deaths did not raise immediate suspicion. Hospitals are busy places. Patterns hide easily in chaos. But eventually, someone started counting, and when they did, my name appeared beside far too many of those final moments. That was the beginning of the investigation and the beginning of the end of my life as I knew it, because once the hospital administration started asking questions, the truth was only a matter of time or a long time. No one noticed. Hospitals are strange places. Death is expected there. It walks the same corridors as doctors and nurses, quietly passing from room to room. When someone dies, people rarely ask why. They simply assume it was time. And for years, that assumption protected me. Patients continued to arrive. Some recovered, others slowly faded away. The hospital remained a constant cycle of hope and loss, and my role in that cycle remained invisible, at least in the beginning. The first person who looked at me differently was a young resident doctor named Daniel Hayes. He had joined the hospital only a year earlier, fresh out of medical school, full of that same idealism I once carried. I remember thinking he reminded me of the nurse I had been decades before. Curious, observant, too observant. It started with small questions. Strange coincidence, he once said during a morning report meeting. 3 patients passed away during the same night shift again. No one paid much attention. The head physician simply shrugged. They were terminal cases, and they were. That was the shield I had hidden behind all those years. Terminal illness, unavoidable death. But coincidences have a way of attracting attention. Over the next few months, Daniel began spending more time reviewing patient records. I noticed him standing at the nurse's station late at night, scrolling through files on the computer screen, occasionally glancing towards the corridor where I walked between rooms. At the time, I convinced myself it meant nothing. Hospitals are full of paperwork and statistics. Young doctors love numbers, patterns, medical charts. But eventually the questions became more specific. One night he stopped me near the medication room. "Can I ask you something?" he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were searching. "Of course," I replied. "I've been reviewing mortality reports for the last 2 years," he said slowly. "Most of the deaths occurred during night shifts." "That's normal," I answered. "Patients decline overnight all the time." He nodded. "Yes, but many of them happen during your shifts." For a moment, I felt something cold slide down my spine, but I forced myself to smile. "That's because I've been working nights for almost 20 years, I said. "Statistics can look strange when you isolate them." Daniel watched me carefully. Then he nodded again. "You're probably right." He walked away after that, but something had changed, because once someone begins asking questions, they rarely stop. A few weeks later, the hospital administration announced a routine internal audit. They claimed it was a standard procedure, something they did every couple of years to review medical records and protocols. Most of the staff barely noticed, but I knew. The moment I heard the announcement, a quiet voice inside my mind whispered a terrifying thought. "They're looking." For the first time in years, I couldn't sleep after my shifts. I would lie awake in the early morning light, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, replaying every moment of the past 3 years in my mind. Every syringe, every quiet room, every flat line on the monitor. At work, I tried to act normal, but the hospital no longer felt the same. The corridors that once felt calm during the night now felt suffocating. Every conversation between doctors seemed like a coded discussion about me. Every glance from a colleague felt suspicious, and Daniel Hayes continued watching. He never accused me. He never said anything directly again, but I noticed how often he appeared near the rooms where I worked, how often he reviewed charts after certain patients died. Then one night, everything changed. It was almost 3 a.m. when the hospital security officer entered the nurses' station. "Administration wants to see you," he said. My stomach tightened immediately. "Now?" "Yes." The walk to the administrative office felt longer than any corridor in that building had ever felt before. Inside the room sat 3 people: the hospital director, the head physician, and a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a dark suit. "Detective." They didn't waste time with small talk. The detective placed a thick folder on the table and slowly opened it. Inside were dozens of patient files. "We've been reviewing mortality records from the past 3 years, he said calmly. He slid several documents across the table toward me. Charts, dates, names, all highlighted in yellow. There's a statistical anomaly," he continued. "An anomaly?" "Yes." He tapped one of the charts. "Patients under your care died at a rate significantly higher than the hospital average." I felt the air disappear from the room. "But that doesn't prove anything," the director quickly added. "Many of these patients were terminal." The detective nodded slowly. "That's true." Then he pulled out another sheet of paper. "Toxicology results." My heart stopped. "After Dr. Hayes raised concerns," he continued, "we ordered post-mortem analysis on 2 recent patients." The room became silent. The detective looked directly into my eyes. They both had unusually high levels of sedative medication in their bloodstream. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the detective asked the question that would follow me for the rest of my life. "Would you like to explain that?" For a moment, I considered lying. It would have been easy. Medication errors happen in hospitals all the time. Dosages get mixed up, charts get misread, machines malfunction. But something inside me was suddenly tired of secrets, tired of pretending. So I looked at the detective and I told him the truth. What happened next destroyed everything: my career, my freedom, my life. But strangely, it also brought a kind of peace, because after years of silence, my confession had finally begun. When I told them the truth, the room became completely silent. Not the ordinary silence of a hospital corridor at night. This was something heavier, something final. The detective didn't interrupt me. He simply leaned back in his chair and listened while I spoke. For the first few minutes, my voice trembled. Years of secrets do that to a person. They build pressure inside the mind, like steam trapped in a sealed container. Eventually, it has to escape. I told them about Eleanor, the first patient. I told them about the night she asked me to let her rest. I described the quiet room, the machines, the snow outside the window. I explained how I adjusted the IV line and increased the sedative dose. No one spoke. The hospital director stared at the table as if the wood itself might crack open. The head physician looked pale. Only the detective remained completely calm. "How many?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air. For years I had avoided answering it, even in my own thoughts. I never counted them. At least that's what I used to tell myself. But deep inside, I always knew. 27, I said. The director gasped. The detective didn't react. Over how many years? 3. And all of them were terminal patients? Yes. That part, at least, was true. Every one of them had been dying already. Cancer, organ failure, neurological disease, bodies that medicine could no longer repair, but intent matters in the eyes of the law. And intention was something that I could no longer hide. Within an hour, I was placed under arrest. Word spread through the hospital faster than any virus. By morning, the story had reached the news. They gave me many names in those first headlines. The angel of death, the silent killer, nurse, the mercy murderer. Journalists love dramatic titles. The truth is rarely as simple. During the trial, prosecutors described me as a calculating murderer who had abused her position of trust. They showed charts, toxicology reports, and hospital records. They displayed photographs of patients and spoke about the families I had robbed of final moments. The courtroom listened in horror. My defense attorney tried to present another version of the story. A nurse pushed beyond exhaustion, a woman who had witnessed decades of suffering, someone who believed, wrongly or not, that she was ending pain rather than causing it. But the law does not recognize mercy in the form I had chosen. In the end, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty, 27 counts. The sentence was life imprisonment. That was 15 years ago. Prison is a strange place for someone who once worked in a hospital. The two environments are more similar than people think. Long corridors, locked doors, controlled schedules, and time. So much time to think. At first, I replayed every moment of those nights in the hospital. Every room, every patient, every decision. I asked myself the same question again and again. Was I a monster, or was I someone who crossed a line that should never be crossed, even for the reasons I believed were compassionate? Years passed before I realized something important. The question itself no longer mattered, because regardless of my intentions, the choice had never been mine to make. Life and death are not decisions any single person should carry in their hands, not a doctor, not a nurse, not anyone. Now I am 68 years old. Ironically, my health has begun to fail in the same way many of my former patients once did. The doctors here say my heart is weak. They speak gently when they explain the prognosis. I recognize the tone. I used it myself for many years. Sometimes I lie awake at night in this small prison infirmary room and listen to the sound of medical monitors from the beds nearby. The same sound that once filled the hospital corridors where my story began. Beep, beep, beep. and I think about Eleanor, about the moment she looked at me and said she was tired, about the moment I decided I had the right to answer that request. If there is one thing I understand now, after all these years, it is this: suffering can break a person, but power can corrupt them even faster. And once you begin believing that you alone can decide who should live and who should die, you have already stepped into a darkness that is almost impossible to escape. This confession is not meant to justify what I did. Nothing can do that. It exists only because the truth deserves to be spoken before I disappear from this world, the same way so many of my patients once did, quietly in a small room with the sound of machines measuring the final seconds of a human life. And this time, the hand that holds the power over life and death is no longer mine.